There is a word in the Gospel of Mark that appears only twice in the whole book, and the two places it appears are miles apart in the story, but bound together like a knot tied under the skin of the narrative. The word is sindon, a fine linen cloth. The first time it appears is in the Garden of Gethsemane, at the arrest of Jesus, when a young man follows the captive crowd wearing nothing but a linen cloth. When the mob grabs him, he leaves the cloth in their hands and runs away naked. The verse itself is only 2 sentences long, and Mark does not embellish it. He gives no name, no motive, no explanation of who the young man was or where he came from. The young man appears out of nowhere, catches the reader's eye for an instant, and then is gone. The last image of him is the pale blur of his body disappearing into the dark between the olive trees, the linen rustling in the hands of the men who grabbed at it and came away with nothing but fabric. The second time the word appears is after the crucifixion, when Joseph of Arimathea buys a linen cloth, takes Jesus down from the cross, wraps him in it, and lays him in a tomb cut out of rock. Mark is the only evangelist who records the first incident at all. Matthew, Luke, and John walk past the naked young man entirely, and none of them uses sindon the way Mark does at the burial. The detail is haunting precisely because Mark refuses to explain it. He reports the strangest story in his gospel and leaves the reader standing in the dark with it. The strangeness is not only that the detail exists, it is where Mark places it. One verse before, the disciples have scattered into the night, and Mark writes that line with a kind of flat finality, and they all abandoned him and fled. That is already the lowest point of the evening. Peter has swung a sword and cut off a man's ear. Jesus has been seized by a mob with swords and clubs, come to arrest him like a bandit. The 12 are gone, swallowed by the dark between the olive trees. Mark could have closed the scene there. He chose not to. He adds a verse about a boy wearing a sheet who gets grabbed, slips free, and bolts into the night without a stitch on him. And this is the Gospel of Mark, the shortest of the 4, the one that moves with such urgency that whole seasons of Jesus' teaching are compressed into a few sentences. The evangelist who cannot afford a wasted syllable spends his most precious space on a running man with no clothes. That economy makes the detail louder. If Mark were a gospel that included everything, the naked young man would be an oddity. In a gospel that nearly cuts everything, he is a deliberately placed signal. Nobody who reads the Gospel of Mark's breathless pace for the first time can miss the way the rhythm breaks at this moment. Everywhere else the narrative rushes. Here it stumbles, almost trips, and stares after a stranger who has just vanished into the night. The reader who has sat through sermons on the arrest of Jesus knows how consistently that signal is ignored. The passage is preached as the story of the disciples' failure, and the naked young man is treated as a curiosity, an unexplained bit of local color, as if Mark simply remembered a silly thing that happened and could not resist putting it in. He becomes a trivia answer, a footnote at the bottom of the page, something to smile at while the real tragedy of the night unfolds. But Mark is not the gospel of aimless memory. It is the gospel of purpose, every scene arranged like an argument. The detail is there because it is doing work that nothing else in the passage can do. And the first place to see that work is in the word itself, a word that would have made the reader in the first century stop and stare exactly the way the narrative stops and stares. The Greek word sindon does not mean any cloth. It means a fine linen sheet, a luxury item, the kind of fabric that cost real money and was reserved for the beds of the wealthy, for the robes of those who could afford to dress even for sleep in something most people would save for a wedding. In the world of the first century, linen was not the everyday cotton of the poor. It was imported, expensive, and carefully maintained. When the young man appears in the garden wearing only this sindon, the detail suggests he is not some random bystander sleeping rough in the olive grove. He has the feel of a person of means, someone who could afford a burial shroud with the change in his pocket. But there is something stranger still. The word does not point to a regular garment at all. It points to a sheet, a shroud, the exact thing you would use to wrap a dead body for the tomb. Mark deliberately chooses this word at the arrest, and then he uses the same word at the burial. He does not have to. Matthew's account of the burial uses a different term, and so do Luke and John. Mark reaches for the same word twice, and only twice in his entire gospel, and he places the two uses like two pillars holding up a roof. The young man in the garden is wrapped in a burial cloth. That detail is so strange that the mind slides off it. Why would a young man be wearing funeral linen? And why would the moment of Jesus' arrest be the moment Mark notices the fabric of a stranger's clothes? The answer to both questions begins to emerge when the second use is set beside the first. Joseph of Arimathea wraps the dead body of Jesus in a sindon. The young man flees from the living body of Jesus in a sindon. One man covers a corpse with the cloth. Another man abandons it to save his skin. One use of the word clothes a body for burial. The other use protects a living man for no longer than a moment before he throws it away. And that is precisely the tension the gospel will not let its reader resolve quickly. The question sits there in the text, unspoken, sharpening as the night goes on which of these men is using the cloth the way it was meant to be used. Joseph of Arimathea wraps the body of a dead teacher in costly linen, an act of devotion that will cost him something in a city where the entire establishment has condemned that man to death. He is taking a risk with his reputation, his standing, possibly his own life, for no other reward than the dignity of a dead man he loved. The young man in the garden uses the same fabric for an entirely different purpose. He is wearing it as a shield, a cover, the flimsiest possible barrier between himself and the world. When the world grabs at him, he does not hold on to the cloth and let himself be taken. He lets the cloth go and runs. The one who uses the linen to protect his own life loses nothing but the linen. The one who uses the linen to honor a man he loved risks everything. That is not merely a contrast between two characters. It is the entire economy of the kingdom of God compressed into a piece of fabric. Following Jesus means taking the cloth that covers you and giving it to the one who is dying. Running from Jesus means keeping your skin and dropping the cloth in the hands of the mob. There is a shame that runs through this passage, and it is older than the passage itself. In the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, the word for what Adam and Eve feel when their eyes are opened is the word for nakedness. Their shame before God is bound to the sudden exposure of their bodies. The first human beings cover themselves because they cannot bear to be seen, and when God walks through the garden, they hide. Mark takes that shame and sets it at the foot of a tree in another garden. The first man hid when God came near. In Gethsemane, at the moment the second Adam is seized, a young man is exposed and runs. The whole of the human condition is compressed into that one sprint across the dark, the unbearable exposure, the instinct to flee rather than be seen, the willingness to drop anything, even the only thing keeping you decent, in order to get away. And this is where the passage turns and looks directly at the person reading it. Everyone who has ever sat in a pew and heard this story knows what it feels like to be caught holding something that was never going to protect them. Everyone has made the exact trade the young man makes: drop the dignity, drop the principles, drop the very thing that made them presentable, and run for the safety of the trees. The flea takes a different form: a lie told to avoid embarrassment, a silence kept to avoid conflict, a friendship abandoned when it got too costly, but the shape is the same. The cloth that was supposed to cover you is suddenly in someone else's hands, and you are exposed, and the night is cold, and you keep running. And what makes the scene unbearable is who stands in the middle of it. Jesus does not run. His disciples have run. The young man has run, and he stands there with the mob closing in around him, already stripped of every protection a person can hang on to. He will soon be stripped. Literally, soldiers will tear his garments from him before he is hammered onto the cross. He knows exactly what is coming. He has said so out loud, in plain words, and none of his closest friends has understood. And still, when the moment comes, he does not move. He does not dart between the torches. He does not leave his own linen in the hands of the men who came for him. He stands in the garden, exposed, and lets the arrest happen, while a boy who has already been caught once wriggles free and disappears into the night. The gospel does not tell us what happened to that young man afterward. It never names him. It never explains him. He simply vanishes, naked, into the dark, but before he vanishes, Mark makes sure we see exactly what he was wearing. And that detail, that strange piece of linen shining in the torchlight, may be the most personal confession in the entire gospel. It is a confession because the tradition is very old that the young man in the garden was John Mark, the man who wrote this gospel. The earliest sources we have do not speak on this point lightly. Papias, the 2nd century bishop who gathered what the elders remembered about the apostles, records that Mark wrote down the stories of Peter accurately, but not in order. The room where the church gathered in Jerusalem, the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark, is the same house where Peter went after the angel led him out of prison in the book of Acts. That house is on Mount Zion, the traditional site of the upper room where Jesus ate the Last Supper with his disciples. The distance between that upper room and the Garden of Gethsemane is a short walk down the side of the mountain. So the young man who followed Jesus from the table to the garden could have been the son of the house, the boy whose mother lent her room for the Passover meal, the only one among the 13 who had not grown up hearing the stories of what it meant to follow a rabbi. He was not one of the disciples. He was something closer to the text itself, a witness who did not yet know what he was witnessing. That he ran away naked has always been an embarrassment to commentators, and the attempts to explain it away are revealing. Some have suggested he was the owner of the garden who slept there and was disturbed. Others say it was pure dramatic detail. But the tradition of Mark as the young man has deeper roots than explanation. If Mark was the author, then this verse is the only place in the entire gospel where the author writes about himself. And what he writes about himself is the worst moment of the night. He does not record his own heroism. He records his own shame. He lets us see him drop the only thing he was wearing and flee into the dark like a man escaping a fire. Except the fire was not trying to burn him. The fire was the light of the torches that surrounded Jesus, and the fire was being led away from him, and he still could not bear to be caught in it. The Greek word used for what the young man was doing as he followed Jesus is sunikalauthe, a compound verb meaning to follow along with someone as a companion on the road. It is the same root word that appears time and again in the gospel for discipleship, the word Jesus himself used when he said, "Follow me," and the men left their nets and went with him. That word, akalautheo, is the technical term for being a student of a teacher, the way a disciple walks a step behind his master so that he can hear every word and match every stride. The young man in the garden is doing exactly what a disciple does. He is walking behind the teacher. But when the teacher is seized, the young man discovers that his physical position was never a spiritual commitment. The grammar itself exposes him. The imperfect tense of the verb means he was in the habit of following. He had been following continuously, and then the narrative breaks. The grip of the mob tears the habit away. The word for what they did to him is kradio, they seized him. The same word used when the religious leaders earlier in the gospel try to arrest Jesus and cannot because of the crowd. They succeeded at last in the garden, but the only victim they could hold was a boy in a sheet. The sheet came away and he ran. The disciple who had been following became the man who was seized, and the man who was seized became the man who was gone. There are two other uses of the word gymnos in the Greek Bible that matter here. In the letter to the Hebrews, the piercing sword of the word reveals the thoughts of the heart, and everything is laid bare the word there is gymnos, naked, exposed before God. In James, faith without works is after the same root image, it is naked. It does not have the clothing it should. In both uses, nakedness is not merely physical. It is spiritual disclosure. It is the removal of every masking layer so that what is actually present becomes visible. The young man in the garden is not the only one whose nakedness is exposed that night. Every disciple is revealed for what he is. Peter, the loudest of them all, will deny Jesus before a servant girl John Mark runs naked, but Peter's denial strips him just as thoroughly. The difference is that Peter's story gets a second chapter. The young man in the garden is only here for one verse, and the reader is left to wonder whether his story ever had another chapter. That wonder is precisely the point. The detail that the young man was sleeping in a sinden, a linen sheet, becomes a devastating commentary on the state of everyone who followed Jesus. A burial shroud is the last thing a person will ever wear, and the young man was wearing his in a garden, under the trees, a few yards from the Son of God in agony. The ability to mistake a shroud for a garment of safety is the ability to mistake death for life. The comfortable cloth told the young man that he was covered, and the moment anyone pulled at it, the fiction collapsed. That is what the gospel does to every false covering. It reaches into the garden where you have built your life, grabs the thing you wore to convince yourself you were present, and you are left not with the choice to follow or not follow, but with the choice to stand exposed with Jesus or to run and keep your life. By the time Mark writes the second half of his gospel, he has already written the line Jesus spoke about the cost of following. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. The naked young man in Gethsemane is the literal picture of that verse failed. He comes after Jesus, but he does not deny himself. He hangs on to his life and the cloth in the dark. He is a negative image of the cross. But Mark, the author, is the one who tells us the story, which means the man who ran away is the man who lived to tell the truth about running away. He could have hidden that detail. Peter would have been happier if that detail had never seen the light of day. The tradition says this gospel is Peter's preaching, and Peter had a vested interest in the version of the garden story in which he alone slashed with a sword and then denied the Lord. But Mark writes the detail that makes Peter look less unique. He writes the detail that makes everyone who ever claimed to follow Jesus see themselves in a boy who was too scared to hold on to a piece of linen. Now examine what happens when Mark reaches the other side of the tomb. On Easter morning, when the women arrive, they see a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they are alarmed. The word Mark uses for this person is niniskos, a young man, the same word he used in the garden. In the garden, the young man wore linen and ran away from a dead man waiting to happen. At the tomb, the young man sits in white, inside the empty grave, and delivers the news that the dead man is alive. The two are paired so deliberately that the reader is meant to see one against the other. The young man in the garden could not bear to witness the arrest. The young man at the tomb sits calmly in the place where the burial cloth should be, dressed in the bright righteousness that the Sinden could never provide. The one who fled is replaced by the one who stays. But the tradition that the narrator himself is the one who fled turns that replacement into a hope rather than a judgment. The young man at the tomb is not a different person. He is what a forgiven runner becomes, still young, still called the same name, but no longer afraid to be seen. Every follower of Jesus is the young man in the garden at some point. There is a moment in everyone's life when the grip of the world closes around you, and you have to decide what you will drop to get away. It is usually not a large decision. It is a small, quiet release. You let go of your integrity for a promotion. You let go of your honesty to avoid embarrassment. You let go of a relationship because it began to cost you something you wanted to keep. The details differ, but the shape is identical. You ran. You left something behind. The cloth that covered your dignity is still in someone else's hand, and you have spent years trying not to think about what that cloth looked like when the torchlight hit it. But the Gospel of Mark is not written by someone who never ran. It is written by someone who ran and then came back and wrote the whole story in such a way that the runner is not mocked but included. He could have made himself the hero. He made himself naked instead. And by making himself naked, he made a space for every reader who has ever walked into a church carrying the memory of the night they abandoned their Lord. The young man who runs away is not erased. He is rewoven into the fabric of the good news. The same one who was sick on his own cowardice becomes the one who tells the women the stone is rolled away, the one who announces that the Lord is risen, the one who points the way back. What lifts the whole passage to its breaking point is the one who stood still while everyone else moved. Jesus does not run. He does not abandon the bed of the cross. He does not become at some future point a better version of himself, because he did not begin from a place of flight. He began from a place of standing, and his standing is what makes the runner's return possible. If Jesus had run, there would be no gospel. If Jesus had dropped his own cover and bolted into the night, Mark would be writing poetry about a failure, not good news about a resurrection. The contrast between the fleeing young man and the standing Lord is not just a matter of moral comparison, it is the architecture of the gospel itself. The whole of the Christian faith is contained in the question of who was moving that night. The disciples moved in every direction except toward the cross. Jesus moved only toward it. So the naked young man is not a footnote. He is the reader. He is every person who has ever loved Jesus and then lived as though that love had a contingency clause. He is the disciple who followed from a safe distance, the parent who wanted the kingdom without losing the family, the pastor who denied the faith to save a reputation, the student who chose the sneering friends over the marked community. And the text does not mock him. It records him. It preserves him in a gospel that was read aloud to congregations who were themselves being caught up in persecutions and was asked to recognize their own fear in his. The gospel recognizes the fear, but the gospel is the story of the one who did not run. The shape of the grace is that the runner's story is embedded within the standing Lord's story. He is not deleted. He is held. In the end, Mark is the only one who could write this moment without covering it in shame. He is the one who had been naked and knew what it was to be reclothed. The gospel itself, the euangelion, the good news, is not that people never fail. It is that the resurrection reaches all the way backward into the dark of Gethsemane and finds the boy who is momentarily free, and then follows him through the night and the cross and the tomb, until one morning he is sitting inside the empty grave, dressed in white, saying the one thing that matters: he is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. That is the sentence the man who ran away spends his entire life writing. And the gospel he wrote does not end with his shame. It ends with the emptiness of the tomb, the proof that the Lord he abandoned had already abandoned the grave.